Before we can understand medieval sleep, we need to understand the medieval bed. And the first thing to understand about it is that it was almost nothing like what you are lying on right now. For the vast majority of medieval people, the peasants, the servants, the urban poor, the traveling soldier, the bed was the floor. Specifically, it was the floor covered with whatever insulating material was available: rushes, straw, bracken fern, dried grass. Over this, a wool blanket or a cloak. Under you, perhaps a straw-filled sack if you were fortunate, or simply the layered rushes themselves. This was not considered degrading. It was considered normal. The floor, in a room heated by a central fire, concentrated warmth. You slept close to the heat source because the heat source was survival. The rushes were changed when they became intolerable, which was not as often as modern sensibilities might prefer, and they harbored insects and mice and the residue of everything that had happened in the room during the day. You slept with this and did not think about it particularly, because there was no alternative, and because human beings adapt to what they cannot change. The raised bed, a wooden frame supporting a surface of interlaced ropes or leather straps over which a straw or feather mattress was laid, was a significant piece of furniture. For much of the medieval period, only the wealthy owned one. A good bed, with its frame and ropes and mattress, and the curtains that enclosed it, represented a substantial investment, one that appeared specifically in wills and inheritance documents because it was worth passing down. The phrase, "sleep tight," comes from this world. The rope supports of a bed frame needed regular tightening to keep the sleeping surface firm. A sagging rope bed meant a bad night's sleep. Before bed, in households that owned such furniture, tightening the ropes was a nightly task. Above the bed of anyone who could afford it hung a canopy, and around it fell curtains, heavy wool or linen hangings that could be drawn to enclose the bed completely. This was not decoration. It was engineering. The curtains trapped body heat, kept out drafts, created a microclimate of warmth inside the bed that the rest of the room, stone-walled, high-ceilinged, impossible to heat completely, could not provide. The enclosed curtained bed was, in effect, a room within a room, a warm interior space that the surrounding cold could not fully penetrate. For those who owned such a bed, drawing the curtains at night and settling into the enclosed warmth was one of the genuine physical pleasures available in a world with few of them. For everyone else, it was the floor and the fire and the hope that the coals held through the night. What went between you and the cold was everything. And in the medieval world, what went between you and the cold was almost entirely wool. Wool is, by any objective measure, one of the finest natural sleeping materials ever used by human beings. It regulates temperature, keeping you warm without overheating, wicking moisture away from the body while retaining warmth even when damp. A wool blanket has a thermal efficiency that many modern synthetic materials struggle to match. The medieval peasant sleeping under a rough wool blanket was, in terms of the insulating properties of their covering, sleeping under something genuinely effective. The wealthy slept under linen sheets, fine woven linen, changed and laundered regularly, smooth against the skin. Above the linen, wool blankets. Above those, a coverlet of heavier fabric. In the grandest beds, a fur covering, wolf, fox, rabbit, or for the truly wealthy, ermine, that provided extraordinary insulation and announced status even in sleep. Feather mattresses and feather pillows existed, but only for the upper classes. The feathers of geese and swans, packed into linen ticking, produced a sleeping surface of remarkable softness and warmth. Owning a feather mattress was a mark of considerable prosperity. For everyone below this level, the mattress was a sack filled with straw, wool scraps, dried bracken, or whatever else was available, topped with whatever blanket or cloak the household possessed. A peasant family might own 1 or 2 wool blankets between all of them, objects valuable enough to appear in estate inventories alongside tools and livestock. Pillows in the modern sense were rare outside the wealthy household. The medieval sleeper rested their head on a rolled cloak, a folded blanket, a bolster of rough cloth stuffed with straw, or nothing at all. The position of sleep was different too. Medieval medical thinking, following the ancient Greek and Roman physicians whose works had been transmitted and elaborated by Islamic scholars before reaching Europe, held that sleeping flat on one's back was dangerous. The ideal sleeping position was on the right side, slightly curled, which was believed to aid digestion and allow the heart to beat freely. Sleeping on the left side was thought to impede the heart. Sleeping on the stomach was associated with bad dreams and disordered humors. Whether medieval people actually achieved this medically recommended position is another question. The body finds its own way in sleep, regardless of what the physicians prescribe. Before sleep came prayer. This was not optional. In the medieval world, the transition from wakefulness to sleep was a theologically serious moment. Sleep was understood in the Christian framework that structured all of medieval European thought as a small death, a nightly surrender of consciousness that left the soul exposed and the body vulnerable. The proper preparation for this surrender was prayer. Compline, from the Latin completorium, meaning completion, was the final canonical hour of the monastic day, the prayer that closed the daily cycle of worship and commended the soul to God for the night ahead. In monasteries, it was sung or chanted in the dark chapel after the last light of day, the monks processing in silence, the service brief and intimate and final. But Compline was not only for monks. The theology it expressed, the soul entrusting itself to God before the vulnerability of sleep, permeated the broader culture. Lay people said their own versions of the night prayer before bed. Pater Noster, Ave Maria, the Creed, a petition to their patron saint, a prayer for the souls of the dead, some form of acknowledgement that they were about to lose consciousness, and that this was, in the strict theological sense, a moment of genuine risk. The prayers before sleep were also protective. Specific prayers and blessings were attached to specific threats. A blessing against fire, against theft, against the demons that medieval theology held to be most active in the night hours. A prayer to Saint Christopher for protection against sudden death in the night, the terrifying possibility of dying in one's sleep without time for last rites, and therefore in an unconfessed state, was one of the genuine anxieties of the medieval night. The sign of the cross was made over oneself, over the bed, over the door of the room. In some traditions, holy water was kept near the bed for this purpose. A few drops on the forehead, the threshold, the window frame. Only after this preparation was the business of sleep legitimate and safe. Then the fire was banked, the candle blown out, and the darkness of the medieval night descended. A darkness we have no real modern equivalent for, complete and absolute and full of what the imagination placed in it. We need to stop here and sit with something that the modern world has made almost impossible to truly understand. The dark. Not the dark of a modern bedroom with its standby lights and street glow, and the faint luminescence of a phone screen face down on a nightstand. Not the dark of a rural house miles from the nearest town. The dark of a medieval night was something categorically different from any darkness most people alive today have ever experienced. There was no artificial light after the fire and the candle went out. None anywhere in the landscape for miles. The streets of a medieval city, and cities were the exception, not the rule, had no street lighting until the 15th century, and even then only in the largest and wealthiest. The countryside was simply dark, the kind of dark in which you genuinely cannot see your hand held 6 inches from your face. The kind of dark in which the only light on a clear night is starlight and moonlight. And on a cloudy night, there is nothing at all. The darkness of a new moon night. The quality of light that the aurora borealis gave on those northern nights when it appeared. They navigated by memory in familiar spaces and not at all in unfamiliar ones. Traveling at night was dangerous, not metaphorically, but literally. Roads were unmarked, terrain was unpredictable, and the dark concealed the edge of the bridge, the lip of the ditch, the branch at face height. For the person lying in their bed or on their pallet, the darkness of a medieval night pressed in from everywhere. The fire, if it held, gave a faint reddish glow from the hearth. The curtained bed gave almost none. The room was dark in a way that was total and physical, and into this total darkness, the mind projected what it had been taught to believe was there. The medieval night was not empty. It was populated by theology, by folklore, by the genuine biological experiences of sleep paralysis and hypnagogic hallucination, by the dreaming mind returning to consciousness, not quite fully. What lived in that darkness was not imaginary in the sense of being trivial. It was imaginary in the sense of being constructed by the imagination from the materials the culture provided. And those materials were rich and specific and frightening in ways that were entirely rational, given what medieval people knew and believed. We will get to all of it, but first, the dark itself. Lie in it for a moment. Let your eyes adjust to something they cannot adjust to. Feel the weight of a night that has no bottom. This is where medieval sleep began. You were almost certainly not sleeping alone. This is perhaps the single most foreign aspect of medieval sleep to a modern sensibility. The idea of a private bed, a private room, a private night. These are recent inventions, products of a particular economic and cultural moment in history that began, roughly, in the 17th and 18th centuries with the rise of the middle class and the architecture of privacy. Before that, across most of human history, sleep was communal. In a peasant household, the entire family slept in the same room. Not the same bed necessarily, though that too, but certainly the same space, within feet of each other, sharing the warmth of the fire and each other's bodies. Children slept with parents until they were old enough to be elsewhere. Grandparents slept in the same room as grandchildren. Where the house was large enough to have more than one room, the divisions were still not what we would call private. Thin partitions, curtained doorways, the sounds of the night passing freely between spaces. In wealthier households, the situation was more stratified, but no less communal. A lord's household might have the lord and lady sleeping in a great chamber, with their personal attendants sleeping in the same room on pallets around the bed. The servants slept in the great hall. Nobody slept alone except by accident or illness. At inns and taverns, sharing a bed with strangers was standard practice and unremarkable. You arrived at an inn, were shown to a room with a bed, and found that the bed already had people in it, travelers who had arrived before you and who expected you to climb in without ceremony. The etiquette of the shared inn bed was real and specific. You arranged yourselves by size. You did not steal the blanket. You did not make excessive noise. This communal sleep was not experienced as a violation of privacy, because privacy, in the modern sense, was not a value the culture had yet invented for the sleeping body. The bed was a social space. The night was a shared experience. Being alone in the dark was, in fact, not something most medieval people sought or desired. Aloneness at night was associated with vulnerability, with the absence of protection, with the particular dangers that the undefended soul faced in the dark hours. Company in the dark was not intrusion. It was safety. The warmth of other bodies pressed close was the most reliable heating system available to the medieval world. A bed containing 4 people was dramatically warmer than a bed containing 1. This was not sentiment. It was physics. And it was how most of humanity slept, for most of human history, before the modern world decided that the night was a private matter. Medieval people did not wait until they were exhausted to go to bed. They went to bed when it was dark. This seems obvious, but its implications are significant. Without artificial light, without the electric lamp, the television, the phone screen that tells the modern brain it is still daytime, the body responded to darkness with the immediate production of melatonin, the hormone that induces sleepiness. Medieval people became genuinely, biologically sleepy when the sun went down, because nothing in their environment was telling their nervous system otherwise. In winter, in northern Europe, darkness fell by 4 in the afternoon. By 5 or 6 in the evening, the household was winding down. By 7, in many households, people were asleep. This meant that the medieval person was in bed, asleep, by what the modern world considers early evening. And they were waking up, not for the day, but for the first time, somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning. This first period of sleep was called the first sleep, or the dead sleep, or simply sleep. It was deep and genuine, the body taking what it needed from the relatively early onset. Contemporary sources describe it as heavy, restoring, the sleep that mended the damage of the day. Medical writers praised it. The church cautioned that it could be too heavy, that a man who slept his first sleep with the full weight of a large supper in him was sleeping unwisely, his digestion laboring against his rest. The duration of the first sleep varied. Season played a role. Longer nights meant potentially longer first sleeps. Individual constitution played a role. But somewhere in the range of 3 to 4 hours seems to have been common, based on the evidence of when people described waking in the night and what they did. This first sleep was followed not by waking for the day, not by rolling over into continued sleep, but by something that the modern world has almost entirely forgotten. It was followed by a period of intentional, expected, socially acknowledged wakefulness in the middle of the night. We will get to this. It is the most important thing in this video. But first, the first sleep itself, 3 or 4 hours of genuine unconsciousness in the cold and dark of the medieval night. The body doing what bodies do when nothing is fighting them. Breathing slowing. Muscles releasing. The mind loosening its grip on the day and sliding with a completeness that the overstimulated modern brain rarely achieves into true rest. Sleep in the medieval world began this way. Somewhere around midnight, or perhaps 1 in the morning, the medieval sleeper woke up. Not with alarm, not from nightmare, not from illness, not from disturbance, simply woke. The way the body wakes when it has taken what it needed from the first phase of sleep and is ready for something different. This is the phenomenon that the historian Roger Ekirch, in his landmark 2001 research paper and subsequent 2005 book, At Day's Close, Night in Times Past, documented in extraordinary detail from sources spanning across the medieval and early modern periods. He found references to a first sleep, and a second sleep, with a period of wakefulness between them, in sources ranging from medical texts to court records to personal diaries to literary works. The pattern was so consistent and so casually referenced, without explanation or apology, that it was clearly not exceptional behavior. It was simply how people slept. The period between the first and second sleep was called, in various sources, the watch of the night, the nocturnal watch, or simply the time between sleeps. It lasted typically somewhere between 1 and 2 hours. What did people do during it? Everything. They prayed. The night prayers, the ones the church had specified for the deep of the night, were said now, in the dark, lying in bed or kneeling beside it. This was the hour of matins in the monastic tradition, and lay people had their own versions of nocturnal prayer that fit into this natural waking window. They talked. The evidence from court records and personal correspondence is striking. The between-sleep period was apparently a time of unusual intimacy and openness, when people said things they did not say in daylight. The darkness, the quiet, the loosened grip of the sleeping mind, all of these created a conversational space different from any available during the day. They had sex. The medieval medical tradition actually recommended sexual intercourse during the between-sleep period on the grounds that the body was rested from the first sleep and the subsequent warmth would help induce the second. This is documented in medical texts with the matter-of-fact tone of people describing a sensible arrangement. They thought. The between-sleep period appears to have been a time of unusual mental clarity, a kind of contemplative state, half dreaming, in which the mind moved freely through problems that the day's busyness had not allowed space for. The historian Eckhart suggests that this nightly period of quiet reflection may have served psychological functions that the modern world has inadvertently eliminated. They got up, checked the fire, drank water, went to relieve themselves in the chamber pot or outside, checked on children or animals, then returned to bed. And then, after this hour or two of wakefulness, they slept again. The second sleep was different from the first, where the first sleep was heavy and deep and restoring. The body's most urgent need met with the full force of biological necessity. The second sleep was lighter, more permeable, closer to the surface of consciousness. This is, as it turns out, not a medieval peculiarity, but a fact of human sleep biology that the two-sleep structure was exploiting naturally. Human sleep is not a uniform state. It cycles through stages, what modern sleep science calls slow-wave sleep, where the body does its deepest physical repair, and REM sleep, where the brain is most active and dreaming is most vivid. Early in the night, the sleep cycles are weighted towards slow-wave, restorative sleep. Later in the night, the cycles shift toward REM, the sleep of dreams, of mental processing, of the integration of experience into memory. The medieval two-sleep structure was, whether by design or by the body's own logic, perfectly aligned with this biological reality. The first sleep captured the heaviest, most restorative phase. The watch of the night came at the natural biological turning point between phases. The second sleep was the lighter, dream-rich sleep of the late night, full of the vivid, memorable, emotionally charged dreams that REM sleep produces. This meant that medieval people woke from their second sleep, typically around dawn or slightly before, from a period of intense dreaming. They had not, as the modern alarm clock sleeper often does, been yanked from the middle of a deep sleep cycle by an external signal. They had been floating near the surface of sleep, dreaming, and they came up to consciousness gradually, carrying the dreams with them. This may be one reason that medieval people took their dreams so seriously. The second sleep ended with natural waking, the body choosing its own moment, the dawn beginning to register even through shuttered windows and curtained beds, the birds making their first sounds, the animals beginning to stir. The return to consciousness was gentle and gradual, the dream world receding slowly rather than being abruptly cut off. Then the day began, or in winter, the dark before the day began, because in January in Northern Europe, dawn was hours away yet, and there was work to be done before it arrived. For the medieval world, dreams were not random noise produced by a sleeping brain processing the residue of the day. They were messages, warnings, visitations, the mind's most direct access to a world beyond the ordinary one. This was not the belief of the ignorant. The most sophisticated theological and philosophical thinkers of the medieval period wrote about dreams with the seriousness they gave to any significant phenomenon of human experience. Dream interpretation was a literary genre, a medical subspecialty, and a theological problem. The fundamental question was one of source. Where did a dream come from? Medieval thinkers inherited a classification system from antiquity, most importantly from the Roman writer Macrobius, whose commentary on Cicero's Dream of Scipio was one of the most widely read texts of the medieval period. Macrobius described 5 types of dreams. The somnium was the enigmatic symbolic dream that required interpretation to yield its meaning. The visio was a straightforward prophetic dream showing future events directly. The oraculum was a dream in which a venerable figure, a saint, an ancestor, an angel, appeared and delivered a message. The insomnium was the ordinary dream produced by anxiety, desire, or the body's physical condition. And the visum was a frightening, half-waking apparition at the boundary of sleep and consciousness, what we would now recognize as hypnagogic hallucination. The theologically significant dreams were the somnium, the visio, and the oraculum, the ones that came from beyond the dreamer's own mind. The Church was both committed to the reality of prophetic dreams, the Bible was full of them, and anxious about the possibility of demonic deception. A dream that seemed to come from God might in fact come from the devil, who was perfectly capable of presenting himself as an angel of light. The result was an elaborate interpretive framework. Prophetic dreams were more likely to occur during the second sleep, when the body was purified of the food and drink of the day. They were more reliable if the dreamer was in a state of spiritual purity, had confessed recently, was not in a state of mortal sin, had prayed before sleeping. The dreamer's physical state mattered. An excess of black bile in the humoral framework produced nightmares and deceptive dreams, while a balanced humoral constitution was more likely to receive genuine visions. The content of the dream was read against a well-developed symbolic vocabulary. Certain images were consistently associated with certain meanings, though the dictionaries of dream symbols that circulated in the medieval period were derived from ancient sources and sometimes strained against the actual experience of medieval dreamers. Dreams were discussed, recorded, and acted upon. The dream that warned of danger was taken seriously. The dream in which a saint delivered instruction was the beginning of a devotional life, a pilgrimage, a career in religion. The dream of the dead was simultaneously cherished and feared. A genuine visitation or a demonic deception wearing a beloved face. You lay down at night in the medieval world, knowing that your sleeping mind was a site of genuine spiritual contest. The God who created you could speak through your dreams. The devil who sought your destruction was equally present. Sleep was not passive. The nightmare had a face in the medieval world. It was called the mare, or the nightmare, the creature of the night. In different European traditions, it took different forms. An old woman, a black horse, a shapeless, pressing weight. But its method was always the same. It came to sleeping people, sat upon their chests, and produced the sensation of suffocation, paralysis, and terror that the medieval world interpreted as a demonic attack, and that modern sleep science identifies as sleep paralysis. Sleep paralysis is a genuine neurological phenomenon occurring in the transition between REM sleep and waking. The brain wakes before the body, before the mechanism that paralyzes the muscles during REM sleep, preventing you from physically acting out your dreams, has released its hold. The result is consciousness with a completely paralyzed body, often accompanied by vivid hallucinations, a sensation of pressure on the chest, and an overwhelming feeling of presence in the room. It is terrifying. It is also extremely common. Studies suggest that somewhere between 8 and 50% of people experience it at least once, and a significant minority experience it regularly. For the medieval sleeper, this experience had a ready explanation. The mare, the demon that rode sleeping people, was as real as the sensation it produced. The remedies against it were specific. Iron near the bed. Iron was protective against supernatural creatures across most European folklore traditions. Certain prayers said before sleep, sleeping on the right side rather than the back, which was associated with increased vulnerability to the mare, leaving a light burning. The nightmare was not the only demonic figure of the medieval night. The incubus and succubus, demonic figures that, in the dominant theological understanding, induced sexual experiences in sleeping people, were also specific, documented, officially recognized phenomena. The Church debated their mechanics with philosophical rigor, Since demons had no physical bodies, how could they produce physical sensations? The answer, worked out in considerable theological detail, involved the manipulation of the imagination and the physical spirit, the substances believed to carry sensation through the body. What these entities actually were, in experiential terms, is not hard to identify. Sleep paralysis, hypnagogic and hypnopompic hallucinations, the vivid, realistic visions that occur at the edges of sleep, the intensely physical dreams of REM sleep, which the sleeping body cannot distinguish from real experience. These are universal features of human sleep biology, experienced across all cultures and all periods of history. What differs between cultures is the story told about these experiences. The medieval story was a theological one, populated with beings from the Christian cosmological framework. In our story, they are glitches in the sleeping brain's management of the boundary between unconsciousness and waking. Neither story makes the experience less terrifying at 3 a.m. The cold was the constant companion of medieval sleep, not metaphorically, physically. The cold of a medieval winter night in an inadequately heated space was a genuine biological challenge, one that shaped every aspect of how people slept, from the clothes they wore to bed, to the positions they adopted, to the people they chose to share their warmth with. Stone conducts cold. Thatch insulates better, but only to a point. The great hall of a castle, the nave of a monastery dormitory, the interior of a peasant longhouse, all of these spaces drop to temperatures that would be considered uninhabitable by modern standards on a January night. The water in the basin froze by morning. Breath was visible in the air. The extremities, feet, hands, nose, required active management to avoid real damage. The solutions available to the medieval sleeper were physical and ingenious. You wore more to bed than you wore during the day in some cases. Wool caps, wool stockings, warm undergarments, not because of modesty, but because heat loss from the extremities and the head was significant and preventable. The wealthy used heated stones, warmed in the fire and wrapped in cloth, pushed to the foot of the bed before sleep to maintain warmth through the early part of the night. The charcoal brazier that burned in a wealthy bedchamber was not luxury, but necessity. The position of sleep in a cold environment is not the spread eagle of a comfortably warm bed. It is curled, knees drawn up, arms tucked, the body as compact as possible to conserve heat. Medieval illustrations of sleepers show this consistently. The fetal curl, the drawn up knees, the head tucked below the blanket line. This was not artistic convention. It was a bed shared with the spouse, with children, with servants who slept on pallets at the bed's foot. All of this was thermal strategy. The more bodies, the more heat. The more heat, the longer the sleep could be maintained before the cold woke you. Peasants who kept animals in their longhouses through the winter, cattle and sheep at one end, family at the other, were not making a decision of last resort. They were deploying the one large source of reliable radiant heat that the medieval world provided, the living body of a large domestic animal, which produces and holds warmth continuously regardless of what the fire does. The cold shaped medieval sleep at every level. It determined who you slept with, how you slept, what you wore, when you woke. It made the bed, any bed, however humble, a refuge. It made warmth not a comfort but a necessity, and it made the moment of leaving that warmth in the morning, forcing the body out of its accumulated heat into the cold air of the room, one of the small but genuine daily sufferings of the medieval world. They did it anyway, every morning, without a heated bathroom waiting on the other side. In the monastery, sleep was not a private matter. It was a communal spiritual practice, regulated to the hour, structured by theology, and experienced collectively in a way that pushed the limits of what human bodies could sustain. The Benedictine rule, the foundational document of Western monasticism, written by Saint Benedict of Nursia in the 6th century and followed in various forms by the majority of medieval European monasteries, specified the sleeping arrangements of monks in precise detail. Monks slept in a common dormitory, a large room with individual beds arranged in rows, the abbot's bed at one end or in a separate cell. They slept fully clothed, belted, ready to rise immediately when the bell rang for the night office. A light burned in the dormitory at all times, both for practical reasons and because darkness was associated with the spiritual dangers of the night. The monks were, in a very real sense, never truly alone. Even in sleep, they were surrounded by their brothers, sleeping within sight of each other, regulated by the same bell, subject to the same expectations. The bell rang for matins somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning. The monks rose, filed into the choir in darkness, and sang the night office, the longest of the canonical hours, which in its full Benedictine form included 12 psalm readings and responsories and could last 2 hours. Then they returned to the dormitory for the second sleep, then rose again for lauds at dawn. The deprivation this imposed was not incidental. It was the point. Sleep, in the monastic framework, was one of the appetites that the spiritual life required mastering. Too much sleep was sloth, one of the capital sins. The monk who snatched an extra hour was committing a real offense against the community and against God. The regulation of sleep was an exercise of will over body, which was the fundamental monastic discipline. And yet, the 2-sleep pattern that existed in the broader culture was built into the monastic schedule as a structural feature. The night office fell precisely in the period between the first and second sleep. Monks were rising not from deep unconsciousness, but from the natural waking that the human body performed at this hour. The rising they did was not as brutal as it sounds, because the body was already beginning to surface. The monastery had, perhaps without fully understanding why, organized its most demanding spiritual practice around a fact of human sleep biology. Medieval medicine had a great deal to say about sleep, and most of it was coherent, internally consistent, and wrong in ways that are interesting rather than simply mistaken. The humoral framework, the theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and their associated qualities, hot, cold, moist, dry, that the ancient Greeks had developed and Islamic scholars had elaborated before passing it to medieval Europe, made sleep a medical phenomenon with specific causes, effects, and optimal conditions. Sleep was understood as a process of cooling and moistening. During waking hours, the body produced heat through activity and digestion. Sleep was the period of restoration, when the vital heat withdrew inward from the extremities to the center of the body, particularly to the liver and the heart, to be replenished. The brain, which had been active and warm during waking, cooled and moistened during sleep, a process that was thought to explain both the heaviness of sleep and the particular vividness of dreams, which occurred as the brain processed the day's experiences in its cooled state. The optimal conditions for healthy sleep, according to this framework, were specific. The room should be moderately warm, not hot, which would prevent the necessary cooling of the brain, and not cold, which would disturb the vital heat. The sleeping position should favor the right side, as discussed, to protect the heart and aid digestion. The last meal of the day should have been taken several hours before sleep and should not have been excessively heavy or windy. Heavy foods produced bad dreams by overloading the digestive system, which disrupted the humoral balance during sleep. The duration of sleep was a matter of individual constitution. The sanguine person, dominated by blood, hot and moist, needed more sleep and slept more easily. The melancholic person, dominated by black bile, cold and dry, slept less well and was more prone to troubling dreams and night terrors. Physicians prescribed specific remedies, herbs that induce sleep when other conditions failed, dietary adjustments to improve the quality of sleep, physical activity to tire the body appropriately before the night. Lavender was prescribed for sleep. So was lettuce, believed to be cooling and soporific. Valerian root was known and used. Warm milk was recommended. The poppy, opium in crude preparations, was available for severe insomnia, though its dangers were partially understood. The physician of a great household considered the sleeping health of his lord or lady as seriously as he considered any other aspect of their physical condition. Disturbed sleep was not a nuisance. It was a symptom pointing to an imbalance that required diagnosis and treatment. In this, the medieval physician was not wrong. The connection between sleep quality and overall health is one of the most well-established findings of modern sleep science. The framework was different. The underlying intuition was sound. The medieval world knew insomnia. It had a name for it, agrypnia, from the Greek, or simply the inability to sleep, and it treated it with the seriousness it gave any medical condition. The causes identified by medieval physicians included the obvious and the unexpected: an overactive mind, too much thinking, particularly about troubling matters, was the most commonly cited cause, and the recommended remedy was both medical and practical. Stop thinking about troubling matters. The advice, then as now, was easier to give than to follow. Excessive heat was blamed, an overheated room, a fever, the constitutional excess of blood in a sanguine individual. Excessive cold was equally blamed. The melancholic constitution, with its cold and dry qualities, was particularly prone to sleeplessness. Pain was recognized as a cause. Indigestion from a meal too heavy or too close to bedtime was recognized. Anxiety, described in terms of the humors rather than the psychological vocabulary of today, but recognizable across the centuries, was recognized. The remedies ranged from the sensible to the folkloric. Moderate exercise during the day was prescribed, exhausting the body's animal spirits so that they were depleted by nightfall. A light supper of easily digested foods, a warm bath before bed, rubbing the soles of the feet with warm oil infused with soporific herbs, the smell of specific substances, rose water, lavender, warm bread, was believed to induce sleep by their effect on the brain through the sense of smell. Psychological remedies were also prescribed. Reading something pleasant but not stimulating before sleep, the medieval equivalent of our bedtime reading, though the literacy required made this available only to a minority. Prayer, the deliberate act of directing the mind away from worldly concerns and toward God, which had the practical effect of displacing anxious thought with repetitive, familiar words. Conversation with a trusted companion to discharge the anxious thoughts that might otherwise circle in the dark. Some medieval texts recommended what we would now call sleep restriction therapy, staying awake longer than usual until exhaustion overcame the inability to sleep, though without the theoretical framework we would attach to it. The person lying awake in the medieval night, watching the fire die and listening to the sounds of others sleeping around them, was experiencing something entirely familiar to people across all of history. The mind that will not quiet, the body that will not surrender, the particular misery of exhaustion that cannot tip into sleep. No era has solved this problem, but every era has tried. Children in the medieval world did not have bedtimes in the modern sense. They slept when they were tired and were woken when they were needed, which was often earlier than their bodies would have chosen. Infants slept with their mothers, or more precisely, with whoever was responsible for feeding them, which in wealthy households was a wet nurse rather than the mother herself. The practice of co-sleeping with infants was universal and unquestioned, born of biological necessity. The infant needed warmth, needed feeding through the night, needed the regulation of its breathing and temperature that proximity to an adult body provided. The church worried about this. The danger of overlaying a sleeping adult rolling onto and smothering an infant was real and documented in coroners' records. The church periodically attempted to prohibit co-sleeping with infants, prescribing specially designed cradles with protective arches to prevent overlaying. These injunctions were largely ignored because the alternative, an infant in a cold cradle, away from the mother's warmth and accessible to the night air, was obviously dangerous in its own way. And because the mothers who had been co-sleeping since their own infancy had learned through practice and instinct to sleep in the light, permeable way of a person monitoring something while unconscious, older children slept with siblings or with other household members, or on pallets near the parental bed. The segregation of children into their own rooms, their own beds, their own carefully managed sleep environments with specific bedtimes, specific routines, specific transitional objects, is a modern development, a product of the child-centered philosophy of the late 19th and 20th centuries. In the medieval world, children simply slept where there was room and warmth. They were expected to manage their own sleep within the household's rhythms, to be woken when needed, and to adapt to the communal schedule that was the only schedule available. The lullaby existed, evidence that parents sang their children to sleep in the medieval world is abundant, from literary references to actual surviving lullaby texts. The impulse to ease a child's passage into sleep, to be present at that vulnerable transition, is not a modern invention. The methods were different. The impulse was the same. The medieval world had a complicated relationship with the body that moved in sleep. Sleepwalking was known, documented in medical texts, in legal records, in the occasional account that survives in chronicles and personal writings. Its cause, in the humoral framework, was attributed to an excess of phlegm, the cold, moist humor, which was thought to produce a state of partial sleep in which the animal spirits could move the body without the full engagement of the rational soul. This interpretation had practical implications if the sleepwalker was moved by their humors rather than by their will. They were not responsible for what they did while sleepwalking. This was a genuine legal question in the medieval world. Cases appear in legal records of individuals who caused harm or committed acts while claimed to be asleep, and the question of their culpability was taken seriously. The spiritual interpretation was more troubling. If the soul was not fully present in the sleepwalking body, if the rational soul had partially withdrawn, then who or what was moving the body? The possibility of demonic influence, of a body animated by a spirit other than its own, was a genuine theological concern. A person who regularly sleepwalked was regarded with the slightly uneasy attention given to anyone whose relationship with the boundary between sleep and waking seemed unusual. Sleep talking was similarly ambiguous. The person who spoke in sleep might be delivering genuine prophecy. The rational soul, freed partially from the body's constraints, might access truths unavailable to waking consciousness, or they might be manifesting a demonic influence. The content of the sleep speech was crucial. Religious or prophetic content was potentially divine. Disturbing or incomprehensible content was potentially infernal. The boundary between sleep and waking, the hypnagogic and hypnopompic states, the partial consciousness that exists on either side of full sleep, was understood in the medieval world as spiritually permeable. When the rational soul loosened its grip on the body, other influences could assert themselves. This was not paranoia. It was theology applied to experience. The experiences themselves, the vivid hallucinations, the paralysis, the movements without volition, were real. The framework was different from ours. The phenomena were not. The question of what to wear to bed in the medieval world had answers that varied significantly by class, culture, and period. But the one answer that was most common for most people, for most of the medieval period, is perhaps the most surprising to modern sensibilities. They wore their clothes, not their outdoor working clothes necessarily. Those might be removed if you had alternatives, and the wealthy certainly changed into sleeping garments. But the idea of a naked or near-naked body under bedclothes was, for most of the medieval period, unusual. The body at night was as vulnerable as it was at any moment, and more so. The soul was departing into the perilous territory of sleep. The demonic was most active. The cold was most serious. Clothing was protection in more than one sense. The nightgown as a specific garment existed by the later medieval period for those who could afford it, a long, loose garment in linen or light wool designed for sleep and distinguished from daytime dress. For the wealthy, this might be white linen, soft and clean, changed regularly. For those below this level, the distinction between day and night dress was less clear. Monks slept fully clothed and belted as Saint Benedict's rule required, ready to rise instantly when the bell rang, their bodies prepared for the community of the night office as they were for any other communal activity. This requirement was both practical and symbolic. The monk, whose body was always prepared for prayer, could not fall into the particular moral vulnerability associated with undress. The head was important. Sleeping with the head uncovered exposed it to the cold and, in the theological framework, to a form of spiritual vulnerability. Nightcaps, not the decorative items of later centuries, but simple wool or linen caps worn to retain body heat from the head, were universal across most classes and periods. The expression of dismissing something as an old wives' tale, notwithstanding, the advice to keep your head warm in bed was medically sound. The feet were equally attended to. Wool stockings worn through the night, the body's extremities being the first to lose heat and the most vulnerable to the cold, were standard where they were available. The peasant who slept in their daily stockings was not being slovenly. They were being sensible. When you share a bed with others, as virtually all medieval people did, the night becomes a social space with its own etiquette, its own frustrations, and its own negotiations. The literature of the medieval period is not silent on this subject. Complaints about bed companions appear in poetry, in fablio, the comic tales that circulated in the vernacular, in medical texts, and in the occasional personal document that survives. Snoring was documented and deplored. A companion who thrashed in their sleep was a recognized problem. A companion who generated excessive heat or insufficient heat was noted. The person who stole the blanket in the night was a comic and a real grievance. At inns, the shared bed with strangers introduced additional variables. The stranger might have fleas, a near certainty, in fact, since fleas were a constant of medieval life that no amount of cleanliness could reliably eliminate. They might snore, they might be sick with something you would rather not acquire, they might have intentions toward your purse that sleep was supposed to prevent them from acting on. The etiquette of the in-bed was specific and understood. You arranged yourselves without ceremony. This was simply the way things were done, and protesting it marked you as either naive or pretentious. You kept to your side. You did not engage in conversation beyond the minimal. You slept in the household bed, with spouse, with children, with household members. The negotiations were more complex and longer running. Who slept near the wall, warmer but harder to exit? Who slept on the outside, colder but with freedom of movement? How the blanket was managed, what the expectations were regarding the between-sleep period and its activities. All of this was the unwritten social contract of the shared medieval night. The one thing that does not appear as a significant complaint in the literature of medieval shared sleeping is the desire to be alone. Privacy in sleep was not the aspiration. Warmth, quiet, and a companion who did not steal the blanket, these were the aspirations. The desire to sleep alone came later, much later. For the nobility, sleep was a political act. The great medieval lord did not simply go to bed, he retired. A ceremony with attendance, with specific ritual, with an audience. The process of preparing the lord for sleep was one of the privileges of the household's senior servants. The chamberlain and his staff removed the outer garments, helped with whatever undressing was appropriate, warmed the bed with heated stones or a warming pan, ensured the fire was properly managed, checked the security of the room. To be present at this ceremony was a mark of intimacy and trust. To be excluded was a mark of distance. The Lord's bedchamber was one of the most politically significant spaces in the castle or manor. Access to it was controlled and graduated. The outer chamber where the household knights slept, the inner chamber where the most trusted body servants had access, the bedchamber itself where only the most intimate household members were permitted. The closer you were to the Lord's sleeping body, the more powerful you were. This was not incidental. It reflected a theology of the body in which the sleeping person, vulnerable, unconscious, their rational soul departed, was in genuine need of physical protection, and in which the trust placed in those who guarded that vulnerable state was the deepest trust available. The Queen's household was organized on the same principle, with its own hierarchy of chambers and its own graduation of access. The ladies of the bedchamber, who literally slept in the royal bedchamber, held positions of extraordinary political significance because they controlled access to the most private space of the most powerful person in the realm. Medieval kings conducted political business in their bedchambers, granted audiences there, received ambassadors. The bedroom was not a retreat from the political world. It was one of its primary locations. The bed itself was a piece of political furniture. The great state bed, enormous, canopied, curtained in the most expensive fabrics available, sometimes featuring carved and gilded woodwork, sometimes incorporating the heraldic devices of the occupant's lineage, was a statement of power as much as a sleeping surface. When a great lord died, the bed he had slept in was a significant inheritance, carefully specified in wills, passed down as an object of genuine value and symbolic weight. To sleep well in the medieval world was partly to sleep in the right bed, and the right bed announced in its every element who you were. The fire was not optional. The fire was survival. In the medieval world, maintaining heat through the night was a genuine management challenge that required active attention and careful planning. The fire did not maintain itself. It required fuel, tending, and the particular skill of banking, covering the coals with ash to slow their burning and preserve them through the night. That was one of the fundamental domestic competencies of the medieval household. A fire that died in the night was a serious problem. In winter, a room without fire could reach temperatures that were dangerous to the very young, the very old, and the sick. Beyond the immediate danger, relighting a fire from scratch by striking flint and steel to produce a spark, catching that spark in a piece of fungus or dried plant material called tinder, nursing the tinder into flame, transferring the flame to kindling, was a process that could take 20 minutes or more, and that required dry tinder that was itself carefully preserved. For this reason, the medieval household treated the fire with a reverence that might seem excessive from the outside. The last act of the evening was the banking of the coals. The first act of the morning was their revival. The responsibility for these acts was specifically assigned, typically to the woman of the household, or in larger establishments to the designated servant, because they were too important to leave to chance or inattention. The fire through the night served multiple purposes. It heated the room to whatever degree it could. It provided a faint light. The ember glow of a banked fire was not darkness, but a dim reddish suffusion that the sleeping eye could register. It was a point of orientation in the dark room. You knew which direction the fire was, and therefore you knew where the walls were, where the door was, which way was toward warmth if you woke cold. And it was company. The medieval person waking in the between-sleep period, lying in the dark of the night, could look toward the fire. Its slow pulse, the coal brightening slightly as the draught changed, fading as the ash settled, was the one visible movement in the room, the one reminder that the world was still turning, that the dark was not absolute, that morning would come. It always came, but the fire was there to remind you in the long hours when you needed reminding. Medieval time was not the time of clocks. It was the time of bells. The mechanical clock began to appear on European church towers in the late 13th century, the very end of the period we're exploring, and spread only gradually. Before that, the measurement of time was approximate, seasonal, and entirely dependent on the sun during the day and on the canonical hours at night. The canonical hours, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, Vespers, Compline, divided the day and night into a cycle of prayer, each marked by the church bell. In a village or town within earshot of a church, the bells were the public clock, the shared rhythm, the framework within which everyone organized their day. At night, the bells continued. Compline signaled the beginning of the night. Matins, the deep of night office, rang in the hours between midnight and 2 in the morning. Lauds rang at or before dawn. For the monastery, these bells were commands. For the village within earshot, they were information. The night is at its deepest. The dark is turning. Morning is approaching. The bell for matins fell, as we have discussed, precisely in the natural waking period between the first and second sleep. This was not coincidence. The monastic schedule had been developed over generations by people who knew their own bodies and their own sleep patterns. The bell for matins rang when people were naturally awake or close to it. It called them to prayer at the hour when prayer felt most natural, the quiet, contemplative, between sleep hour when the mind was loosened from the day and the second sleep had not yet claimed it. For the village not in a monastery, the matins bell was simply a marker. It is the middle of the night. The world is at its most still. Whatever you are doing in your wakefulness, praying, talking, lying in the dark, thinking, you know where you are in the night's architecture. The bells gave the night a shape. Without them, the dark was formless. With them, it was a landscape with landmarks. The person lying awake at 2 in the morning, hearing the faint matins bell from the distant church, knew exactly where they were. They were between sleeps. The bell had confirmed it. They would sleep again soon. The traveller who needed to sleep on the road in the medieval world had options, and most of them were uncomfortable. The inn, or hostelry, tavern, or alehouse, the terminology varied by region and period, was the commercial provision of sleep, and it operated on different principles from anything a modern hotel guest would recognize. The primary difference was not price or cleanliness, though both differed significantly from modern expectations. It was the complete absence of private space. The medieval inn provided a bed, not a room. The bed was in a shared space with other beds, other travelers, other people's luggage and animals and plans for the morning. In the better establishments, the beds were enclosed with curtains that provided visual privacy, if not acoustic. In the lesser ones, the travelers simply lay down together on straw pallets in a common room and made the best of it. The cost of the inn bed included typically a meal, the evening supper and sometimes the morning breakfast, and sometimes the stabling of a horse. It did not include the absence of other people. Other people were part of the arrangement. Beyond commercial inns, the traveller could seek hospitality from the church. Monasteries maintained guest houses. The rule of Saint Benedict specified the duty of hospitality to travellers, and most monasteries honoured it, providing food and a place to sleep to those who asked. The quality of monastic hospitality varied considerably. The great abbeys on major pilgrim routes maintained elaborate guest houses with separate accommodations for different classes of traveller. The smaller rural priory offered what it had, which might be a corner of the monk's own dormitory. Noble households were also expected to offer hospitality to travellers of appropriate status. The great chain of hospitality that ran through medieval society meant that a knight or lord travelling could expect to be housed and fed by those of similar or greater status along his route. The political and social relationships that this hospitality network maintained were not incidental to it. They were part of its purpose. For the poorest traveller, the pilgrim without resources, the labourer between situations, the displaced person with nowhere to go, the options were the church porch, the barn, the haystack. These too were documented sleeping places used by real people, part of the full spectrum of where the medieval world slept. Illness changed sleep, and sleep changed illness. The relationship between the two was one of the central concerns of medieval medicine. The sick person in the medieval world was put to bed as a first response, not because rest was believed to be curative in the way modern medicine understands it, but because the humoral theory of illness held that the body's vital heat needed to be concentrated and conserved during illness rather than dissipated through activity. The bed kept the sick person warm, which was understood to support the vital processes that illness threatened. But the sleep of the sick was also watched because it revealed information about the course of the illness. Excessive sleepiness, the torpor that accompanied high fever, was a bad sign, suggesting that the vital heat was flagging and the humoral balance was seriously disturbed. Inability to sleep was equally concerning, suggesting an excess of agitation in the humours. The quality of sleep, its depth, its restfulness, whether it was accompanied by sweating or convulsion, was part of the clinical picture that the physician or the attending family member monitored. The sick person's dreams received particular attention. Dreams during illness were believed to be especially significant. The weakened rational soul was thought to be more permeable to both divine and demonic influence, and the dreams it received were therefore more likely to be genuinely prophetic or genuinely threatening. The physician asked about the patient's dreams as part of his assessment. Specific herbs and preparations were used to induce sleep in the sick, on the grounds that sleep was necessary for recovery. The poppy, in preparations that we would now recognize as crude opium, was prescribed for severe pain and sleeplessness. Valerian, henbane, hemlock, the last two toxic at high doses, were used in carefully modulated preparations that required real pharmacological knowledge to administer safely. The attending person, almost always a woman of the household, for nursing was domestic work, sat through the sick person's night. She monitored the breathing. She changed the cloths on the forehead when fever rose. She watched for the signs of crisis, the night sweat that might break a fever, the rattling breath that presaged the end. Her own sleep was irrelevant for the duration. The medieval night was not shared only with other people. In the peasant longhouse, the animals came inside in winter. Cattle, sheep, goats, brought in from the cold to share the warmth of the human habitation and to contribute their own body heat to the household's thermal economy. This was not a decision made reluctantly. It was a deliberate and rational strategy, understood by everyone who practiced it as essential to the survival of both the animals and the family through the worst of the winter cold. Sleeping in proximity to large domestic animals changes the night. The sounds are different. The low periodic sound of cattle breathing, the shift of weight from hoof to hoof, the occasional vocalizing that livestock produce in the dark. The smells are different. The ammonia of livestock waste, the hay, the warm animal smell that is distinct from the human smell of the sleeping family. The thermal environment is different. A cow produces significant body heat detectable across a room. The dogs slept inside too. In all but the poorest households, the working dogs, the shepherd's dog, the farm dog, the lord's hunting hounds, were part of the domestic sleeping space. They chose the warmest available spot and occupied it with the unapologetic confidence of animals that had been co-sleeping with humans for 10,000 years. They served a practical purpose at night. Their hearing was far more acute than their owners, and they would wake at sounds that the sleeping human would not register until too late. The cat existed in the medieval household primarily in a working capacity, as a rat and mouse hunter, indispensable in the grain stores and equally in the house where grain was stored or food was kept. Cats are largely nocturnal. Their activity through the night, the sounds of a cat moving, hunting, occasionally catching something, was simply part of the acoustic texture of the medieval night. The boundary between the human sleeping space and the animal sleeping space was porous. Animals moved through the night with their own agendas, their own rhythms, their own relationship to the dark. The human sleepers adapted to this, incorporated it, slept through it, or were woken by it, and went back to sleep. The night in the medieval household was never entirely still. It breathed with the composite respiration of everything alive within its walls. Before we discuss the end of medieval sleep, we should understand what waking up meant in a world without alarm clocks. The medieval sleeper woke when their body was ready, when an external sound registered, when the cold demanded attention, when the child cried, when the animals began their morning restlessness, when the light, even through closed shutters and heavy curtains, began to change the quality of the darkness. This is waking as it occurred for most of human history, gradual, self-directed, responsive to genuine environmental cues rather than to an arbitrary imposed signal. The alarm clock is, in historical terms, extremely recent, a product of the industrial world and its demand for synchronized labor, its need to move large numbers of people from sleep to work at precisely the same moment, regardless of what their bodies were doing. The absence of alarm clocks in the medieval world did not mean that people overslept. Quite the opposite. The light came when the light came, and in agricultural societies, the light commanded more absolutely than any clock. In winter, the work before dawn, the fire revival, the animal care, the preparation of the day's food had to happen in the dark, and had been happening in the dark for as long as anyone alive could remember. The transition from sleep to waking was gradual in the medical understanding as well. The vital heat, which had withdrawn to the center of the body during sleep, needed time to rediffuse to the extremities. Rising immediately from deep sleep was considered medically unwise. The body needed a period of gentle waking, of stretching and gradual movement, before the demands of the day could be safely imposed on it. Whether people actually observed this recommendation is another question. The demands of winter and agricultural labor are not known for their patience with medical advice. What the gradual waking allowed in the natural two-sleep pattern was this. The sleeper surfaced from the dream-rich second sleep slowly, carrying the dreams with them, their consciousness assembling itself piece by piece. They lay in the warm dark of the bed or pallet, between sleep and full waking for some time that was neither one nor the other. This liminal state, the hypnopompic half-consciousness of natural waking from REM sleep, was considered by medieval medical writers to be a state of particular mental clarity and creativity. Problems that had not resolved during the day sometimes resolved in this state. The mind, still partially in the loose associative mode of dream, made connections that the focused waking mind would miss. Then, full waking, cold air on the face, the fire to revive, the day. The two-sleep pattern did not end dramatically. It faded. The culprit was light, specifically artificial light. The gradual improvement in lighting technology through the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries that made it increasingly possible to extend the waking day into the evening hours. Candles improved, then oil lamps improved. Then, in the 19th century, gaslighting arrived in cities, and the street became illuminated in a way it had never been before. Then electricity. Each improvement in artificial lighting pushed the bedtime later. When you can read by lamplight, you stay up to read. When the street outside is lit and safe, you go out in the evening. When there is entertainment available, the coffee house, the theater, the assembly, rooms of the 18th century, you are awake and social at 10 in the evening. You go to bed later. And when you go to bed later, the natural first sleep takes longer to arrive, and the between sleep waking period, which the body insists on at its biological time, regardless of when you fell asleep, arrives in the middle of the night rather than in the early hours of evening. Instead of waking at midnight after going to bed at 8, you wake at 3 in the morning after going to bed at midnight, and at 3 in the morning with no fire to tend, no prayer to say, no natural community of other waking people. The waking period feels wrong. It feels like insomnia. The historian Roger Ekirch has suggested that a significant portion of what the modern world experiences as insomnia, specifically the middle of the night waking that afflicts so many people, is not a dysfunction at all. It is the body's natural two-sleep pattern, preserved intact in our biology from hundreds of thousands of years of human sleep, expressing itself in a cultural environment that no longer has a place for it. We woke at midnight for all of human history. We did things during that hour. We prayed, talked, made love, lay in the dark and thought. It was expected and normal and provided for. Then we moved bedtime later, and the midnight waking became a problem. The solution, from a modern medical standpoint, is typically to consolidate sleep, to treat the middle of the night waking as a failure and attempt to eliminate it through sleep hygiene, medication, behavioral therapy. This works to a degree. The consolidated 8-hour sleep is achievable for many people, but it came at a cost. The between sleep period, that quiet, contemplative, intimate hour in the dark, is gone. The space for the kind of thinking that only happens in that half-awake state, the conversations that only happen in the dark between sleeps, the prayer that the medieval world considered the night's most important work. All of this was eliminated not by decision but by lighting technology, without anyone fully understanding what they were giving up. You may have experienced it. The waking at 2 or 3 in the morning. The mind moving in ways it doesn't move during the day. The particular quality of thought that the deep of the night produces. You probably experience it as insomnia. You probably try to suppress it. The medieval world would have recognized it immediately, would have reached for the prayer book, or turned to speak quietly to whoever lay beside them, or simply lain in the dark and let the mind move where it wanted to go. They would not have called it a problem. We began tonight with a simple observation. The way you are sleeping now is historically unusual. Over the course of this video, we have seen just how unusual. The private bed, the private room, the 8 uninterrupted hours, the darkness managed to a comfortable level, the temperature controlled, the alarm clock waiting. All of this is a very recent arrangement, the product of the last 2 or 3 centuries, the outcome of specific technological and economic developments that happened to produce this particular form of sleep. What medieval sleep looked like was different in almost every dimension, communal rather than private, interrupted by design rather than continuous, conducted in genuine cold and genuine dark, shared with animals, with strangers, with the full household, structured by prayer and theological expectation as much as by biological need, rich in dreams that were taken seriously, divided into 2 phases by a period of wakefulness that the modern world has largely eliminated. And yet, and this is the thing worth sitting with, medieval sleep was not considered inadequate. The people who slept this way did not describe themselves as sleep-deprived or poorly rested by their own standards. They slept in accordance with their biology, their culture, and their physical reality. They adapted to the cold and the dark and the communal space the way human beings always adapt, by finding the arrangements that worked and perpetuating them. The 2-sleep pattern, in particular, deserves more attention than it receives. The idea that human beings naturally sleep in 2 phases, with an hour of wakefulness between them, is supported not only by the historical evidence that Kirch assembled, but by contemporary sleep science. When modern research subjects are placed in conditions of natural darkness, no artificial light, no imposed schedule, they spontaneously begin to sleep in 2 phases, with a wakeful period between them. The biology is still there. We have simply built a world that suppresses it. This is not an argument for returning to medieval sleep conditions. The cold, the darkness, the communal crowding, the fleas, the rats. These are not things to romanticize, but there is something in the medieval relationship to the night that the modern world might consider. The between-sleep period as a legitimate space for thought, prayer, conversation, and the particular kinds of mental activity that only the dark and the quiet and the loosened mind produce. The acceptance of interrupted sleep as natural rather than pathological. The understanding that the night has its own character, distinct from the day, and that what happens in it deserves attention rather than the imposition of an 8-hour blackout. You will wake in the night, probably. At some point, the body insists. When it does, tonight or some other night, you might try something different. Instead of reaching for your phone, instead of trying to force yourself back to sleep, instead of lying in the dark worrying that you are not sleeping, you might simply lie there. Let the mind move where it goes. Let the dark be dark. Let the quiet be quiet. You are between sleeps. It is the most normal thing in the world. It is what people did for all of human history, in the cold and the dark, beside the dying fire. Rest now. The second sleep is coming.